first of all, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Frankie Sadoun. I'm the Resource Development Director at Mitveim. And today we just want to thank you all for joining us either on this call or if you're watching the video back later. We know this is a really difficult time for Jews, for Israelis, and also for people who care about the conflict and who are interested in what's going on. After the events of October 7th, I think a lot of people were left with many questions. So we're hoping that through this call today, we can answer some of those questions for you. We're going to be diving into the regional political perspective on the Gaza campaign. So as we all know, this conflict is not limited to the local sphere. The fighting might be on the ground in Israel and in Gaza, but is at risk to spread further across the region and become a situation that involves the US and other regional allies. So what we want to do today is really dive in. Each one of our speakers is going to unpack different attitudes and interests from the region and how each country is going to respond moving forward. And just to give a little background on Mitveim, we were founded in 2011. We are a think tank based in Israel, and we deal with promoting and developing regional policies that advance Israel's belonging, as well as reshape its relations with our neighboring countries, the Mediterranean, Europe. So today we are going to start off with Dr. Gil Murciano. He is our CEO at Mitveim. And Gil, why don't you take it away?
Sure thing. The 7th of October is a day that would live in infamy for Israelis, for Jews, for, I would say, citizens of the free world altogether. This is, we've been doing a couple of these international briefing before. This is, I think, the first one we actually did in a full-blown war. And I think that what we are experiencing today is not just a shock to the Israeli system from within, but also a challenge to the basic assumptions that we held for many years, that became almost axiomas in our way, the way we look at the region, at the diplomatic and the national security of Israel, whether it is about the possibility of coexistence with Hamas, on the one hand, the idea of conflict management that Israel does not need, the anti-solutionism, that is all Israel needs is a conflict management program and not a conflict resolution, something that Mitveim was very strong against during the last decade. Or whether it is about the role of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, by the way. In the spirit of normalization, we tend to marginalize it, to see it as a marginal issue. I think this conflict shows that this conflict is not just influential for the regional stability, but also to the global, even on the global level, on global geopolitics altogether. So it is time to re-examine our basic assumptions, and more importantly, what we took upon ourselves in Mitveim, I would say, a true faith-based initiative, I would even define it, not just rational, is the attempt to start and design the day after, to take the war that was forced upon us and to turn it into a turning point, a political diplomatic turning point in our relations with Palestinians, in our ability to move to conflict resolution and the two-state solution, in our relations or the strategies and the frameworks that are being built in order to counter Iran and the axis of resistance. So in this time where we understand that nothing will be the same, or not, I wouldn't say nothing, but a lot is changing fundamentally. What we are trying to do, and Dr. Omer Tzanani that is with us, is leading this team, leading this important effort, is to speak about the day after, and to explain and to produce policy ideas and to convince that the goals that are set in front of us in the rather military discussion in Israel today about causing the collapse of Hamas or about creating a new equation are in the end a political diplomatic question in its core and not a military issue. And that's part of what we're trying to do. And what we're going to hear here today is the full range of experts representing different dimensions, different regional dimensions of the current development. So who's first by the list, Frankie? Who's starting? Who will we start with?
So first up, we have Roy Kibrick. This is our Director of Research at Mitveim, and he's going to be discussing the fall of presumption.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
You're great.
Yeah. Okay. Well, on the morning of October 7th, as you said, numerous long-standing assumptions that have accompanied us, and I mean us is the Israeli public, the Israeli government, the region, the world, for many years, were shattered. Many presumptions at a tactical or local level were broken. The assumption that smart barrier around Gaza would prevent the invasion of terrorists, the assumption that technology could reduce human forces, the assumption that Hamas is deterred, the assumptions that Hamas could be bought with money and that it bears political responsibility, thus behaving with political rationality, the assumption that Israeli intelligence is maybe flawless, the assumption that is, if something would happen, probably it would start in the north with Hezbollah or in the West Bank with a new intifada and more. But I want to focus specifically on the broader presumption that broke on the morning of October 7th. First is the assumption that we could bypass the Palestinian issue towards normalization with the Arab world. A premise that Hamas attack proved false, not only to Israel, but also to Arab states. That it's not feasible to do so, and that we have to invest in solving the Palestinian issue before or with turning to reshaping the Middle East. But it cannot happen without it. It's not just Israel, as we saw, that directly threatened by Hamas violence. The lack of solution of the Palestinian issue threatened regional stability and the ability to build a broad coalition under the American umbrella, one that can ensure stability and combat the radical political Islam. At the end, as we can witness now, the absence of a solution to the Palestinian issue possess a potential existential threat for Jordan, for example. It challenges the authority, the stability in Egypt, in Morocco, in the United Arab Emirates, in Bahrain, and in all the other countries that wish to cooperate with Israel and cannot do it while the streets are burning and stand with the Palestinian struggle. So this is the first presumption. The second assumption is that we could manage the conflict and live with it forever, paying a reasonable price. Again, Hamas attack on the kibbutzim around the Gaza border shattered these assumptions as well. And this was the strategy of all Netanyahu's government and also the Bennett government. It was also supported by the Israeli public. In our last survey in Mitvim, most of the Israeli public believed that we should continue with the same policy towards Gaza, minimizing the conflict, which is in fact another form of conflict management, was understood by the governments around the world during the Bennett's government as an acceptable interim solution, as long as it's not Netanyahu managing the affairs. So it seems now that Israelis, regional countries, and also the world are no longer willing to accept the continuation of conflict management and are seeking a crucial decision. And indeed, the shattering of these two presumptions provide us with a moment of opportunity to make significant decision and lead to a resolution of the Palestinian issue. But here we must address another growing presumption. It's growing now, that nothing will return to the way it was. And we have to be aware of it. There are many players and forces that would be happy to quickly end the bloody conflict in Gaza and return to the same approach of conflict management. Not only Netanyahu would obviously almost prefer that, but even others may not be so eager to invest resources in breakthrough decisions. Even for Biden, although he said it yesterday and the day before, in an election year, freezing the situation in the Middle East may be preferable than taking risky major moves. So the struggle over the narrative of the events happening today is ongoing as they unfold. It is a struggle we are engaging with the aim of promoting peace and a solution to the Palestinian issue. We see in the solution of the Palestinian issue the central guarantee for the security and prosperity of Israel. We are currently fighting to turn the collapse of these presumptions that I spoke about into a different reality. And it's a struggle. We're into it, and we need all the help that we can get. Look, today we mark the National Memorial Day for the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. And it is both very sad and infuriating to compare him to the current leadership in Israel. And to contemplate on where we could have been and how much bloodshed could have been avoided. If Israel had a functional, reasonable government who seeks its benefits, and Israel had chosen the path of a two-state solution, there would now be an opportunity to unite under the American leadership all the forces opposing the radical political Islam and seeing it as a common enemy, the radical Islam, including the Palestinian leadership recognizing Israel. The absence of an Israeli decision on a two-state solution constitutes actually, and my friend Professor Podeh wrote a book about it, but it constitutes a missed opportunity, a big one, indicating that the Israeli government continues today to see Hamas as an asset and prefer to sacrifice the kibbutzim around Gaza in favor of the settlements enterprise and the desire of the settlers to continue and pray, I don't know, at Joseph Tom in Shechem or building a sukkah in Hawara. So we have an opportunity, we have to seize it, and Israel cannot do it alone. We have an opportunity as the presumptions are shaken and shattered and broken, but we have to continue and reshape reality and fight for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roy. Really interesting points. And I think that's something that Mitveim is heavily focused on right now is, of course, it's hard to say at a time like this, we're going to take the opportunity, but we're hoping this is a turning point in the crisis and that we can use that to adopt a new reality moving forward. The next speaker we have is Dr. Omer Zanani. He is the director of the Israeli-Palestinian Peacemaking Program at Mitveim. And right now he is spearheading our main efforts, which are the Day After Task Force. Go ahead, Omer.
Thank you, Frankie. Thank you all. I want to talk a bit about the team, the task force, or the think tank, whatever you call it, that we thought about it, Gil and I, on the second day. We understood that we have to work on it almost on the first day, and it's working. And we have many very important insights that will be sent to you also in many ways. But I want to talk about the team itself. The team itself has experts that deals with many angles of the situation. For example, the regional approach, people that are experts on the Arab world, people that are experts on the international arena, and people that are experts on the Palestinian issue and on policy issue. So we're trying to bring many angles as possible. And the team is working. We made five debates until today, 5 think tanks until today. We're talking about the day after, but we also talk about conceptions that were blown away and also about things that should be done today in order to prepare ourselves for the day after. So it's not really disconnected from what's happening during the war right now. And I'll give you an example, or at least one example about it. So in my very short time, I will talk about 3 main guiding principles that we understand today that has to take us from the end state of the war towards the solution that Roy mentioned, the two-state solution. And it's not only the two-state solution, it has to be said. First of all, we understand that it's really a blow to see a government that don't put a political goal during a war. You know, it's not a round military campaign against Hamas in Gaza Strip, which take 3 or 4 days, that you can say, okay, we'll return to the managing the conflict as it used to be in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. It's a war. It's not only a war, but it's a big war with many actors from the north, from Iran, even from Yemen, and we have the Gaza problem. So there has to be a political goal. But when we look at the day after, the main insight is that no one will take the keys of Gaza without a political goal. It means that the political goal has to be, if not from today, it has to be the starting point at the day the war ended. Okay? This is the first. And the second one is about the Palestinian Authority. Whether we like it or not, the Palestinian Authority is our address. And we understand that Abu Mazen said it himself, the Palestinian president, the Palestinian Authority is not ready to take control on Gaza Strip and will not be ready to do it in a month or 2 months from now. But we do understand, and when we understand that the PA is the address, we have to do things from today to strengthen the Palestinian Authority, alongside with the understanding that there has to be reforms, on the security level with the Americans, with the Arab world. We know what to do on the day after, but we have to look from today how to encourage the PA to be a future partner for us, and not to say it's corrupt and there's no partner and there's nothing to do. So I know it's a change in the thinking, but I think it's very, very important. For example, dealing with the objectives, with the Hatufim, with the
hostages, basically, or the kidnapped.
the hostages, the kidnappers. Maybe we can approach with the PA also, and not only with other actors. The third one, and this is the name of the the webinar itself, is we have to look at the situation in a wide range of regional approach. Now we understood it, many of us talked about it many years ago, that Israel and Palestine is not a playground that we can, not only that we can't solve our problem alone, but we understand that in order to deal with Iran on the day after, and to deal with Hezbollah, and to deal with Syria, and to deal with the Palestinian arena, it's not enough to work bilaterally between us and the Palestinians like it used to be in the rounds of the past. So it has to be something different. Now, about the goal itself, I think alongside the obvious understanding that there has to be a two-state solution in the end, we also understand that another goal is to bring about a new regional coalition with the Arab states, headed by the United States, in order to deal with all the things that I said. So these are three main guiding principles that we understand today. There are more, and I'm sure we'll talk about the interim stage and about the question of elections in the Palestinians arena, and about the way to deal with the element of Hamas that will stay after the Hamas will be blown away. And there are many questions, but I think the best would be to leave it to the questions and answers. That's all from my point of view.
Thank you, Omer. And speaking of questions and answers, you guys can feel free as we are moving along to type your questions in the chat. We'll get to them at the end. We'll do a full Q&A session and make sure to touch on everyone's questions here. So just leave them there and we'll either respond as we go or at the end we'll touch on them. So the next speaker I want to pass on to is Professor Eli Podeh. Eli is a board member of Mitvim, as well as a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He teaches in the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies. And Eli is going to be speaking about the Egyptian perspective regarding the conflict.
Okay, thank you very much all. I'm happy to give my angle. So far we have discussed mainly the future, and now we are going to move and talk about the present. But let me add one word about the past. Roy mentioned my research on missed opportunities. Well, one of the conclusions of this research was that wars, and that might sound unfortunate, but wars usually they constitute an opportunity. And if we look not only at the Israeli-Arab conflict, but also around the world, that there were the beginning of negotiations between the warring parties, and sometimes, not always, it led also to settlements and even to peace agreements. And Israel and Egypt in 1973 and what followed is a very good example. So that was only a short comment about the past. And now let's go back to try and analyze the Egyptian position. Now, it goes without saying that Egypt is a very important actor in the whole episode, the war, and the Egyptian role is as a result of two main things. First of all, the geographical proximity, and secondly, its role in the Arab world in general. Now, there's one thing that we need to remember, and this stands in contrast maybe to the rhetoric of the Egyptian government and President Sisi. In principle, in the main interest of the Egyptian government is to annihilate, no less, to annihilate a Hamas organization. And the Egyptians were very much against Hamas when it took power in 2007 from the PA and had to get used to this unfortunate result. But what we saw along the years that the Egyptians, they gave Israel a rope, a free hand sometimes, to hit Hamas, and that was particularly the case in 2014 in Operation Protective Edge, which lasted for more than 50 years. So basically, this is the interest. However, they need to maneuver, and they need to maneuver because they have different dilemmas or interests, and I like to mention three in particular. The first one, they are very much concerned from the possibility that Palestinian refugees will come to Sinai. It already happened once on a limited scale in 2008 after Hamas took over, but this is something that they are very much afraid of, and they will try to prevent at all cost, I think. And in their memories, quite vivid, is still what happened as a result of the Arab Spring, when Sinai, actually the Egyptian army and police, they lost control in Sinai, fighting the offshoot of ISIS in the peninsula, and took them a few years, with the help of Israel, by the way, to get over this problem. And they wouldn't want to go back to this situation. And therefore, when, for example, the Israeli Minister of Intelligence, Gila Gamliel, publishes that what we heard, a report that is calling or recommending the settlements of Palestinians from Gaza in Sinai. I mean, this is a sheer ignorance of the situation and something that obviously might lead to a serious tension, deterioration, and more than that, between Israel and Egypt. So we have to be very careful in that regard. The second issue is Egypt as a mediator. Now, obviously, the Egyptians, they see themselves as the leader of the Arab world. This is not the case, not any longer, mainly because of the economic situation. But still, in their perception, their image, this is their role. And therefore, they want to show everyone in Egypt and elsewhere that they are playing a role, whether it's the humanitarian issue, which indeed they are playing a very crucial role. And secondly, with the question of the hostages. Now, they have another mediator or another competitor, which is Qatar. And Qatar, since 2014, is playing a very important role in Gaza by transferring the money and humanitarian aid and so on. And now, with regard to the question of the hostage. So far we have seen some division between the two, but in the long run, it seems that Qatar must take over in this issue because Qatar has maybe a bigger leverage. We'll hear shortly about Qatar on Hamas. But in any case, they want very much to play a significant role in that regard as well. And the third issue is public opinion. Public opinion is very extreme. To a large extent, many of the writers in the Egyptian media, social media, newspapers, internet, there are a very hostile attitude toward Israel. However, there are quite a few other voices which are blaming Hamas and so on, but you can't really notice them when you look overall at the Egyptian media. The result is that the Sisi regime obviously has to relate or to address, and therefore what we see is that officially most of the statements are quite negative, in particular supporting not Hamas, but the humanitarian situation and the need to solve it, while putting a finger at Israel for not doing enough. But in any case, whenever they are talking in the long run about the possibility or the need for a settlement, they are obviously talking about a two-state solution. This is their position. Now, if we go specifically now to Israeli-Egyptian relations, then we have to remember, this is quite obvious, Israel has to do its utmost in order to maintain those relations and not to get to the point where it might be possible to cut off relations, to suspend the agreement. If we go back to the past, it never happened. The extreme step was recalling the ambassador. That happened in 1982, the first Lebanese war. That happened during the second Intifada. So that might be a possibility when we'll see a serious deterioration in Gaza and perhaps in the region as well. And this is a possibility that Israel has to take into account. Nevertheless, in the past, even during the Intifada, I need to finish, Funky?
No, you're ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. If we go a little bit back to the Intifada, so the Egyptians, they indeed recalled their ambassador, but you know what? Omar Suleiman, who is the head of the general intelligence, well, the most important security man at that time, very close, the closest to Mubarak, he mediated constantly. He was roving between Ramallah and between Gaza and between Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. So they indeed play a very important role, while at the same time they recalled the ambassador from Tel Aviv. So in any case, the Egyptian role is always very crucial, and therefore we should do our utmost in order to safeguard this relation. I think that what we need now is not only legitimate leadership in Israel, but also wise leadership. Leadership that understand all the constraints that we have here in the Middle East. We tend to forget, and this is something that I remember that I spoke when the Abraham Accord was signed. The Abraham Accord obviously were highly positive, but at the same time, they constitute a constraint because the Arab states, now certain Arab states, they have a leverage over Israel because they can always say, we might recall ambassador, we can suspend the relations. This is something obviously which stands in complete contrast to Israeli interests. So Israel has to maneuver very cautiously here in the Middle East, particularly vis-a-vis those countries that signed a normalization peace or normalization agreement with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Podet. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Moran Zaga. Moran Zaga is our expert on the Gulf states and a professor at the University of Haifa. She's a policy fellow for Mitweim, and today she's going to be speaking about the perspective from the Gulf.
So my main argument is that the Gulf countries has a broader role in this war than just acting as mediators. And yes, we know that they are mainly mentioned in this event in the context of the role as mediators. Indeed, I think it's a crucial role at this point due to the lack of trust between the Palestinians and the United States or other European countries. And we know that mainly Qatar is now in front of the scene, and the UAE and Saudi Arabia are presumably behind the scenes through Egypt. The Gulf states were already involved in the Palestinian arena and in the mediation task before October 7. They have trust with the Palestinians. They build certain channels of dialogue. They know how to work. They know the people, and they have past achievements. Plus, I believe that they have a deep interest in presenting constructive steps while looking at the West reaction to the atrocities that we had on October 7. So I think they are in shock as we are in shock, and therefore I think they are trying to do what they can do in order to not be stained with these atrocities. But as I said, I suggest that they have a broader role, and this role is mainly dedicated to the regional battle or struggle that we have seen for the past decade. The Gulf states, including Qatar, by the way, called a war and a military intervention in Yemen in 2015. And why do I go back to that? Because for them, for the Gulf states, the war in Yemen and in other places was a war against terrorism, was a war against extremism, against Iranian proxies, and against non-state actors. If you take each one of these justifications, you see that it's exactly the same war that we have against Hamas. It's a terrorist organization, an extreme organization. It's working with Iran, and it's a non-state actor. But at the same time, Qatar refuses to use this rhetoric, obviously. And the Gulf leaders, the other Gulf leaders, are in a catch here. They are torn between the overwhelming anger in the Arab public opinion and their understanding that it is actually a continuation of their own fight against terrorism and instability. So this is the main argument, and that's why I think that from an Israeli perspective, when we highlight the Hamas is ISIS banner, I think we should also highlight for the Arab countries that Hamas is also the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not just a slogan, it's an actual institutional part of the Muslim Brotherhood, an ideological part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it's linked to the Houthis. To show the same link, and we were actually under attack of the Houthis a few days ago. So it's not, again, a slogan. It's an actual. It's actually the same war. I think this is the story here. This is the main story, and I think that the Gulf leaders are perhaps concerned about the possibility that this escalation will escalate even further to the northern front. While if it escalates to the northern front, it means regional escalation, a regional war, going back to the same point they were a few years ago, and the war in Yemen cost them a heavy price. I'm not sure they want to be in the same place again. So this is why I think we see their hesitant reaction, sometimes condemning Hamas, but sometimes condemning Israel for their what they call a collective punishment against the Palestinian people. So this is the point where we are. I agree with Ellie's point that from the perspective of the Abraham Accords, the Gulf states are on the one hand, very, very critical against Israel, But it's true, as Eli said, that they are not using yet their heavy weapons against Israel. They're not calling back ambassadors. Ambassadors came back because they are afraid of their personal safety. But they did not use these political sticks, and that's why I have room for optimism that the Gulf states, the moderate Gulf states, will join us in this moral and ideological battle. I'll conclude with that.
Thank you so much, Moran. That was extremely interesting and just kind of explaining away the misconception that Israel is battling right now with Palestinians. It's obviously a much wider issue, and as we see from your presentation, we see it across the Gulf states. The next speaker we're going to have is Dr. Gil Marciano, our CEO, and Gil will be speaking about the Iranian perspective and how the war is going to be affected from the northern border. Go ahead, Gil.
Sure thing. I mean, there's two questions we need to ask about Iran, really. The first one is really basic, and it's asked around the world in intelligence services and among think tankers. And it's the question, basically, is Iran behind all of it? Is the 7th of October is part of a master plan created by the supreme leader or by the IRGC, by Kahani or others, as part of a strategy that we know about, the unifying arenas, the idea of challenging Israel from different directions. We know that the Iranians and the proxies followed the internal, the domestic disagreements in Israel because of the judicial reform in Israel and so on. But the question is, are they behind it? This is not just an academic question. Our assessment about the way the situation unfolds in the future relates to whether we see something that is part of a major plot or a situation where the Iranians are responding to the events. Now, I think that we have to speak about a couple of levels of involvement here. There's no question that Iran, at least in the last 4 or 5 years, with the strengthening of relations with Hamas, trained, provided offensive capabilities, equipment, even strategic, logics to the actions of Hamas. I would even say that there's very little room there's a very high probability that Iran at least knew about the general intention of Hamas to escalate things. But when it comes to the idea of actually orchestrating, navigating, defining, designing the operational features of the attack, we really do not have any evidence at the moment. I would say, there are some indications, there are some publications about a cyber attack that was launched simultaneously with the Hamas attack, a cyber attack that is probably a state capacity level and not something that Hamas could have launched alone. But for me, the closest evidence that Iran, while providing the strategic direction for such an attack, is not exactly behind the actual navigation of the attack, is the fact that they didn't actually escalate in the most sensitive time from the Israeli point of view. According to this scenario, the 8th or the 9th of October will be the best time for them to introduce a second front to Israel, when Israelis were just trying to come to their senses and recruit reserves. They didn't do that. There might be other disincentive, but at least on the level of reacting immediately in some kind of a master plan that doesn't look like one. And if we assume that Iran is not behind the actual planning, of course, it provides the prevailing wind, it provides the backing, provides the capabilities, but it's not part of a mega plan, then I will say that Iran is currently facing a serious dilemma because of this attack. A dilemma between two things. If they do not intervene, if they do not expand the conflict, if they do not activate, as they did before, but in much larger magnitude, the proxies, Hezbollah, the militias in Syria, the Houthis of Yemen that Moran mentioned, then they are standing the chance of losing credibility, prestige in the Arab world. The entire idea behind unifying arenas is that they provide some deterrence against Israeli actions. And therefore, they might even lose some of the trust of their proxies. The expectations of those proxies, especially Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, is that Iran would play the same role they played in the Syrian civil war, coming to the help of the Assad regime being a game changer, or at least a deterring factor in this situation. However, there are also some very strong disincentive for Iran at the current moment to actually expand the conflict. And maybe the major one is the possibility that such an expansion, such an Iranian involvement, would cause them to lose the two major assets that Iran built during the last decade or two in the region. First one is Hezbollah, of course, while grooming this organization to control Lebanon, a crucial component in the deterrence equation or the deterrence apparatus that Iran created vis-a-vis Israel for a possibility of an Israeli attack on Iranian soil. And the second one, which is rarely mentioned, is their nuclear project. Iran is very close, or some would say are already on the level of a nuclear threshold state. What the Iranians are risking here is to become just like Saddam Hussein with the invasion of Kuwait, a year before reaching WMD, providing the excuse to the international community, to Israel, of course, of an attack over the nuclear facilities in Iran, and a combined Israeli-American attack, exactly the Israeli script, if the expansion of the conflict would actually reach a regional conflict. And that's one hell of a disincentive. The second disincentive is the loss of the element of surprise. I mean, we have the entire reserve force of Israel, recruited, mobilized, and now looking towards the north. We have two battle groups, basically, two air carriers groups, which are currently in the Mediterranean. We have the American beefing up their defenses all around. It's not exactly the perfect time to actually launch such an attack, and that's another major disincentive. I will add another one. The third one is really should be examined with a grain of salt, and it's the situation of Lebanon. If we treat Hezbollah as an actor that has any Lebanese or has any ambitions or any consideration for Lebanese considerations, then in the current states of Lebanon, such a war, a future war with Hezbollah, would mean the total destruction of Lebanon altogether. So seemingly, when we look at this set of consideration, we can rest easy that maybe the possibility of an expansion of the conflict is somewhat, it's not in the cards. But here we have to assume, and with this I will end, two different scenarios. First, a scenario where, and a very probable scenario, when Israel launches a ground offensive in Gaza, pushes Hamas with his back to the wall. It is true that Hamas does not have the same worth, is not the same asset as Hezbollah for the Iranians. It's on a much different priority. But the possibility or the dilemma that I described, the gap between the two options becomes wider and wider, and the pressure on Iran to act is becoming much larger. The temptation, especially when we see human casualties uproar in the Arab world, of presenting themselves as the defenders of the Arab world, is going to grow. And then what we might see is not necessarily an all-out escalation, but maybe a ladder of escalation, an attack against a strategic target in Israel, against the gas installation, for example, the drill installations in the Mediterranean or other strategic. I wouldn't say it would go for broke altogether, but that would be one option. An attack from Syria, by the way, which is something that we have to consider. There are certain incentives to start with Syria and not Lebanon if you are an Iranian, an IRGC, a Revolutionary Guard, a commander on that level, on issues of legitimacy and others. And even then, the option of an overarching escalation is still there. And the reason here is, most of you are students or teachers in the field of Middle Eastern conflict, and you know that most conflict in the Middle East, they start not from intentional escalations, but unintentional escalations. The case of 2006, the Second Lebanon War, is a great example. We are currently experiencing a limited warfare already between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. The possibility that, God forbid, a rocket from Hezbollah would hit civilian population, causing civilian casualties. The fact that the Israelis are now in a state of mind of over-alarm after the failure of early warning in Gaza, the possibility of an action and reaction, this self-intensifying escalation that we know so well, is very high. And if you ask me, the most likely possibility for this conflict becoming a regional one, without us even noticing almost, is from unintentional escalation. The chances of those are much higher than before. And I will end with this.
Thank you, Gil. We have two more speakers left. First, we're going to have Dr. Maya Tzion Sadiku right now. She is the director of our Israel-Europe Relations Program, and she'll be speaking about the European perspective. And before Maya starts, I just want to give a shout out to her. After the events of October 7th, Maya sat for days gathering information about the abductees and presenting it at the EU Parliament in Brussels. And we are extremely proud of her and thankful for her efforts. So I just wanted to highlight that before she gets started. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you, Frankie. Good afternoon or good evening. Between the day that we scheduled the briefing and today, there have been evolvements in the EU-European stance on the war on Hamas, which I would like to present. So I'll start 2 weeks ago and come to current state of affairs, and I'll try to speak a bit about the day after, about the EU's role in the day after the war. In the first 2 weeks since October 7th, we've seen unprecedented European solidarity stressing Israel's right to defend itself. We could see it in numerous visits by Israel to Israel by heads of 2 EU institutions, the Commission and the Parliament, by heads of governments and states of the biggest member states in the EU, Germany, Italy, and this week also France. We've seen a visit by the UK and also many leaders of other European countries that came to see with their own eyes the massacre that was done by Hamas and stand in solidarity and support of Israel. Now, I think there are 2 European camps that support Israel. The one is the very supportive, and the other one is the more moderate, nuanced supportive camp. Last week, for example, the European Parliament, just to show you how unprecedented the European support of Israel is. So last week, the European Parliament passed an unprecedented resolution that condemns Hamas and supports Israel. And 500 members of European Parliament voted for that resolution. They represent 71% of the members of European Parliament. Only 21 members of European Parliament objected to that resolution. So again, this is unprecedented in Israel-European Parliament relations. Now, still, this European support is also stressing how important it is that Israel will be conducting this war according to international law and international humanitarian law. And this expressed not only the European Union's values, it is also important for the EU to be depicted by Russia or by not to be depicted by Russia or by Putin as having double standards when it comes to Israel war in Gaza. So the stress on international law and conducting the war according to international humanitarian law is extremely important to the Europeans in their war to support Ukraine. Now, Israel is aware that the more it will be able to conduct this war according to international law and international humanitarian law, the longer the leadership in Europe will continue to support it. We have heard from previous speakers about this gap between the leadership and the public opinion. We could also see it rising in Europe, and that is a challenge. Now, in the past days, we also see the more nuanced camp that is supporting Israel, but would like to see, for example, humanitarian ceasefire to enable the transport of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. So we see more those buts coming to the surface. Now, I would also like to mention that in previous rounds of escalations that obviously were much less violent than this one, the European support of Israel was much weaker, and then it flipped after a couple of weeks when the number of casualties and the scale of destruction in Gaza Strip rose. So I think as it is very clear that the humanitarian state in Gaza is very dire, and it's the most dire situation in numerous years, my sense is that the last couple of days, we've seen a little bit more of that voice of that nuance camp that is stressing what is important to the European, also to speak to the public opinion in Europe and for the humanitarian causes of the war. Today and tomorrow, the European Council of Heads of member states is convening, And we see already the gaps between those two camps rising. And unlike Russia's war on Ukraine that united the European Union, it also united NATO. When it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, even as everybody stressed that Hamas is ISIS and it does not represent the Palestinians, we already sense the usual split between the pro-Palestinian and the pro-Israeli camp. And that brings me to the internal European pressure that are increased by this war inside the member states that are of concern to them. So first, we've heard a lot about the fear of escalation to the north, destabilizing the region much further, and destabilizing the region would have implications on Europe. So first, such an escalation would divert the attention of the world from the war of Russia in Ukraine. And this is also uncertain to what extent the United States can conduct two regional wars, such really heavy wars, and can fight as efficiently on both fronts. I think the United States is much more involved here militarily. We do see United Kingdom also sending some military ships, but Europeans are less involved in military aspects here. Now, second, this war raises concern of homeland security, the fear of Islamic jihadist terror in Western Europe. And the third concern would be that if indeed this war would escalate to the north, then a refugee crisis from Lebanon to Syria and to Turkey is again on Europe's doorsteps. And if we take all of the above into consideration, then it has political implications other than the Arab countries that don't hold democratic elections in Europe. The political leaders are looking even more closely to the public opinion, and the rise of right-wing populist or extreme political parties in Europe is a challenge when immigration is on the rise, when terror is on the rise. And this is probably why we could hear President Macron, for example, speak both of a coalition against Hamas, while he also visited the Palestinian Authority, unlike other European leaders, and he met Abu Mazen at the same time. So he was trying to hold the sticks from both ends. There is no contradiction, I actually think. I think this is a nuanced European voice that some Israelis, maybe many Israelis, may be willing to listen to in the long run, not right now, but in the long run. So the more European countries stand with the United States and Israel and the moderate Arab countries, the more that those countries can form a coalition against radical Islam and provide security, the more Israelis would listen, and at least with some interest to the European voice. I would also stress that in Eastern Europe, the main concern there these days is not the Middle East conflict, but obviously Russia's war against Ukraine, and they don't want to subtract that the European attention. We do see the Middle East being the first one at the Foreign Affairs Council and also on the European Council agenda and the European Parliament. So I would say that Zelensky and the Foreign Ministry of Ukraine are visiting Brussels even more today to stress the importance of gaining back the attention of Europe to Ukraine. And we can see a very clear axis of Russia, as an Israeli, I think we could see a very clear axis of Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas. Some people before me spoke about the Houthis in Syria. China is there. We haven't discussed it yet, but it's there on the background. And that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, the other camp is the United States, EU, NATO, and Israel is also included there, and in a much more nuanced way, the moderate Arab world is there in the fight against Iran, but in Europe, Russia is much more a closer enemy and much more security risk to Europe than Iran is. Also, as I spoke, the public opinion in some parts of Europe is very much pro-Palestinian. We've seen the demonstration. So it's a problem for the leadership to keep its support of Israel for a long duration. Just one short minute about the day after the war, and here we can also talk about it later in the Q&A. The EU and Europe stress that Israel needs to have this political goal that Gil was speaking about and others to call to, and Omer was speaking about, to call to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict peacefully in the long term. And Joseph Borrell, the High Representative of the EU for Common Foreign and Security Policy, was actually speaking already about the state solution, maybe 3 days to the war. The EU has a role to play, but I think it needs to have much more nuances in the way it pronounces it, and not to repeat the old phrases of, the automatic phrases of two-state solution in order to gain the ear and attention of Israelis. Probably, mostly I don't speak about the current Israeli government, but about the next one. So the EU has the role to play also in the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, again, in the long term, under Palestinian rule, which means there should be this long vision, political vision, separate between Israelis and Palestinians, or in some sort of a political manner. And to end with the last point that I think was of interest to some Israelis, and they grasped it when Emmanuel Macron was speaking. He was speaking about a coalition that would fight Hamas, as there was a coalition fighting ISIS. So such a European stance is very interesting.
Nadav, can you mute
Nadav,
yourself?
Okay, and so such a European stance, as Macron has elaborated, is very interesting. And to know that Israel is not alone in this fight, and it's not fighting this war by itself. Obviously, the United States is here, and to show this axis that behind Hamas stands Iran. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maya. Thank you for really tying that all together, and especially bringing in the political aspect that we've been saying. This is not just a conflict of armies or fighters. This is really a political situation that needs to be dealt with. The last speaker we have up, and we will go to the Q&A afterwards, is Nadav Tamir. Nadav is the executive director of J Street Israel. He is extremely, extremely well connected and has years of experience in the sector. So Nadav, please represent the U.S. perspective here.
In a board member of Mitzvim, I have to claim the affiliation. We're very proud to claim the affiliation.
I'm proud as well to be on the board of Mitzvim, and I'm sorry if you'll hear noises here because I'm surrounded by people who are doing the sacred work of helping the families of the abductees in Gaza. In terms of the American angle, I have to say that I usually like to analyze foreign policy that is driven by three main things, which I call VIP: values, interests, and politics. I think what President Biden, the Biden administration did in this case was a masterful way of aligning all the three. By embracing Israel in an amazing way, both in his speeches that touched every Israeli, including people who thought before that Trump was better for Israel and that Biden is too old and the Democrats are not on our side. He was able to touch every Israeli, and he was able to create credibility in order to be able to promote American interests. I have to say the Hague was not just instrumental because it is authentic for Biden, but it gave him a lot of leverage, and he's using that leverage every day. I do believe that without the American role here, we would have a ground invasion a long time ago. We would have had all the abductees dead, and we might have been involved in a regional war. And the fact that the US is trying to promote its interests, which are not to let this become a regional war, and they're using deterrence. You mentioned the two aircrafts, the Ford and the Eisenhower, that brought to the area and already were able to intercept missiles from Yemen, and a lot of intelligence sharing, but also American generals that are sitting in the most sensitive meetings trying to explain to the Israeli politicians and that what is the American experience. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, I want to remind all of you that President Biden is probably the most experienced president in terms of foreign policy ever, even more than Bush the father, who was head of the CIA and ambassador in China. And he knows what happens when you get into a fighting zone without an exit strategy. He witnessed it in close hand. He knows that what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan actually helped make Iraq an Iranian proxy, create a vacuum for ISIS. I think you know the story. And he wants to make sure that when Israel is fighting to defend itself, which is completely understood, that Israel is fighting against Hamas and not against the Gazan population. He keeps on saying that not all Gazans are Hamas, which is backed by numbers, by the way, but most Israelis ignore it. He keeps on saying that it's important to act according to the international law. And even if you put morality aside, the only way for Biden to keep this coalition with the Europeans is international law, which is in Israel, people usually ridicule, but in Europe, it's almost the Bible. And he also trying to make sure that whatever happens in Gaza is connected with a diplomatic political horizon. He mentioned it a few times. And in some ways, this is, as some Americans call, don't ever let a crisis get wasted. I'm sorry, we have.
I'm sorry to stop you, but we have an alarm, a rocket alarm.
Yeah,
so
me too.
I mean, some of us would have to go to, I assume, safety first. So if you can stay with us for 5 minutes, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. We just have to go to the shelter. We'll be back in a short while.
Go ahead, guys. Go. Be safe.
As I spoke about the VIP, values, interest, and politics. So in terms of values, it's clear that President Biden not only feels a Zionist, as he always keeps saying, he also believes that he is a leader of the free world, and he believes that Israel is part of it, which was also very much demonstrated during the protest, when he showed pretty clearly that he's on the side of the protesters and not on the side of the government, because he wants Israel to remain a liberal democracy. And he also sees this as part of the Ukraine-Russia, the China Cold War, as the free world against the others. So this is the values. The interest is that he, as I said, want to make sure it doesn't become a regional thing that will draw the United States and derail its attempts to both get an agreement with Iran and normalize relations with Saudi Arabia, which was what was happening before that war. And the reason why he wanted to have this normalization with Saudi Arabia is because he understood that leaving a vacuum in the Middle East brings China in. China was the kind of facilitator of the Iran-Saudi Arabia deal, the Russia and Iran. He doesn't want to let Russia and China fill the vacuum of the pivot to Asia. And in terms of politics, he knows that he cannot really promote any domestic agenda since the midterm elections, when he lost the House to the Republicans. And he knows that even on foreign policy issues, he needs the Republicans. And the only way to pass a big legislation to support Ukraine is to put it together with Israel, and that's the only way to bring the Republicans to vote for it. It wasn't possible until yesterday, but since yesterday we have a Speaker of the House, so actually the budget or the supplemental could go through, but he understands that without putting Ukraine and Israel together, he cannot do it. And in general, I think he understands that the only way for him to create legacy until the elections is in foreign policy, because he cannot do anything domestically. And the same success that he had in the Ukraine-Russia war, keeping NATO together, adding Finland and hopefully Sweden soon to NATO, is a huge success. And maybe he could repeat that by using this tragedy into an opportunity to create a political horizon and to use all the things that Mitvim always write to him, how to promote a two-state solution out of this tragedy. I'll end here.
Thank you, Nadav. I think we'll go through some of the questions we have here, and I'll go one by one. Ellie, are you on the call? Yes, you're still here. So one of the questions is, can you speak a little bit more about the relationship between Hamas and the Sisi government?
Well, first of all, I don't know if you noticed, but we had a siren in our area. Okay, so I just had to go to the shelter.
Yes.
Okay. As for the question, it's a very good question, and unfortunately, I don't think that there is a good answer. The thing is that most of Hamas-Egyptian relations, or I mean connection, are held in secrecy. And the one who is responsible for that is the general intelligence, which, by the way, is more or less the situation with Israeli-Egyptian relations. It is true that we have also an ambassador and so on, but the important link is through the intelligence, and sometimes, at least in the past, it was directly with the presidency. So with Hamas, we know that they are in good contact with Hamas, and that was the situation along the many rounds that we had before. The Egyptians, they have a certain leverage, but it's not the same leverage as the Qataris has on Hamas. So therefore, I think that I'm going back to the contradiction that I mentioned before, that while they are trying to have some, under quote, normal relations with Hamas, they are very much operating against them, and therefore they are playing a very cautious role in this regard. I know that I didn't say much about how it's being done, but the very fact is that we don't know a lot.
Thank you. I think I'm going to address this next question here to Omer. Are you worried about a replica of inter-ethnic violence between Israeli Jews and Arabs, as in 2021? There are signs, symptoms, fears of a deterioration already happening.
Well, that's a good question, and we are in a fear of escalation inside the 48 borders of Israel. But I think there are two things that brought it down, the concern on this question. First of all, I think in a way there is a trauma from what happened in 2021, not only on the Arab sector, but also on the Jewish sector. So there are lessons learned. This is the first one. But the second, maybe more important, I think the political echelon of the politicians of the Arabs in Israel went straightforward from day one, because of the fear of the authentic fear of escalating inside Israel, and said very clearly, be patient and don't go out to demonstrate. There are demonstrations, there are signs of attempts of escalation, but basically things are calm, and I hope it will stay calm in the future. Until now, it's good enough from my point
And I want to
add something,
add,
Frankie, to this, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Very shortly. I just have to say that one of the only positive surprise, with all the failures of the system during this last conflict, especially after 2021, is until now, and knock on wood, it would stay the same, is not just the fact that the Arab Israelis are not a hostile factor, but I would even say in some aspect, you see a cooperation on civil society level, on individuals, common people, that is incredible.
Yeah.
Almost the opposite of what we see in 2021. Of course, there's criticism and so on. The voices mentioned by Eli, the minority voices that go against Hamas, that comes and say, I'm a Palestinian, I'm fighting for my rights, I'm not mitigated in any way, but this is not my fight for freedom. Atrocities and rape and abuse is not my... You see it coming from Raja Natur, from some of the leading, most critical Arab thinkers and authors in the Israeli Arab society. And it might be the case when we speak about the day after, the possibility of Israeli Arab cooperation, which is built in such times. If we need to look at some kind of an optimistic vision, what happens right now, I think, changes somewhat, opens the door with the civil society in Israel taking the role, filling the gaps left by the government. There's new opportunities maybe here for Israeli Arab cooperation.
Thank you, Gil. That was really what I was going to say, is we're seeing actually quite a big difference from 2021. And it's one of the silver linings, I'll say, that we can see right now. I'm going to go to the next question. Is there any chance of Israel holding elections in the midst of war? I think let's direct this one towards Roy.
Why? I'm a political expert. In Israel, I don't know. I can't see any scenario of such new elections during war. Maybe an alternative scenario is a different government. If you could, bring some of the current government members to accept the idea that it is not a viable situation, and to move aside and allow a broad coalition emergency government before an election, maybe. But otherwise, I can't see it now. Politically, I can't see it happen.
I'm going to read the rest of this question.
Maybe other things differently. I don't know. I'm not a political expert.
I'll leave it open to the table, but let me read the rest of the question here, and anyone can feel free to respond to this one. Is there any chance of Israel holding elections in the midst of this war? Is there a chance of removing right-wing elements for a broader, more legitimate coalition? And with the PA, what would recognition of the PA look like? What about unresolved issues? And, what has changed on the PA side that Israel would accept? Does anyone want to answer this one?
I want to talk about the PA, and specifically I want to talk about one of the biggest questions that is raised during our talks in the think tank, is the question of elections. Now, we're not talking only about presidential elections in the PA, but there are also elections of the local and of the legislative council. And we have a bitter experience from 2006. Well, the democratic elections gave rise to Hamas, and it's now becoming a very big question because of the status of Abu Mazen and his age, and the question of bringing back the PA to the Gaza Strip. And the main insight that I can have is not to look only at the past experience, but trying to look at the different context of the Palestinian arena, that maybe Israel and specifically the Americans can put terms to these elections that weren't used in the past. For example, elections that people that are heading Hamas or PIJ or those kind of elements that are unlegitimate for being elected will be out of the picture. And this gives rise to other people than Abu Mazen. And here I want to mention another important question, an important figure as Marwan Barghouti, which leads in the polls in the Palestinian arena, but he is a prisoner with his future is for many years in the prison. But now when we're talking about the abductives and the possibility of exchanging prisoners, this thing might be opened again for rethinking about the place of Marwan Barghouti in the elections in the Palestinian arena. These are two insights that I can leave inside. This is my part. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Omer. Nadav, you want to go ahead?
Yes, I think that the question of elections is very relevant for both Israel and Palestine. It's quite clear it cannot do anything serious in terms of political horizon. But I believe that this government is not sustainable. It wasn't even sustainable before the war because of the fact that the liberal majority in Israel has woken up. And we saw in the polls that this government is losing popularity every day. I believe that after the war, after all the protest organizations who actually became filling the vacuum that the government has left, will turn the heat in even more profound way towards the government. And then I hope we will get rid of the only government with Iran and Hamas in Gaza that is against the two-state solution in the world. And in terms of Palestine, I'm looking at public opinion polls all the time, especially by Khalil Shkaki, and I see that with a political horizon, Hamas will shrink dramatically. It go back to his side in the Palestinian society, which is less than 30%. Hamas is becoming popular only with a lack of political horizon. With political horizons, Palestinian elections will create leadership that will be pro two-state solution. The current government has lost legitimacy. Abu Mazen is very unpopular in Palestine, but you know, Omer mentioned Barghouti. The Palestinians will still vote for Fatah, but not for Abu Mazen, and for any move towards two-state solution, you need a legitimate Palestinian partner that represent both Gaza and the West Bank, and that can only happen with elections, with a big push and support from the international community.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nadav. Ellie, do you want to say something? I see your hand raised.
I saw that
Roy, we'll get to you next. No, Ellie, you can go ahead. We'll get Roy next. Don't worry.
Okay. All right. So first of all, one comment regarding the question of elections. I want just to remind that in 1973, the elections were due in late October. And as a result of the war, they were postponed to late December. So I don't think that any elections can be held at the time of a war. This is one. The second, in any case, in order to have any horizon, we need to have a plan, obviously, but what is more important is that we'll have legitimate leaders on both sides. And right now, on both sides, the Israelis and Palestinians, we don't have legitimate leaders. So therefore, I think that we'll have to see, first of all, a domestic change in Israel, whenever it will be. It will take some time, obviously, but also on the Palestinian side, because Abu Mazen, first of all, I mean, his age might be an impediment, but more than that, he is not considered a legitimate leader. So I think that we'll have also to wait for a change among the Palestinians. And finally, a word about someone asked about the press and the responses and so on. And I've completed an article which will publish in the weekend in Mako on the various responses in the award. And I went over many of the responses and tried to make some order or to see some logic. So obviously we know that most of the responses are negative. This is very much true. But in continuation of what Omer said at the beginning about the Israeli Arabs and some positive responses, you can find it also in some of the Arab countries, particularly in the Gulf, and particularly in Saudi Arabia. And that might be maybe not surprising at all, given the whole issue of the possible normalization and so on. But when you read some of the articles in the Sharq al-Awsat, which is a Saudi but outside in London, but also Saudi on Saudi soil, you see quite a few they are criticizing quite vehemently Hamas for, I mean, a reckless attack that didn't serve the Palestinian cause. It caused a lot of damage to them, and so and so. So these are interesting voices, and obviously a lot depends on what will happen in the near future, whether they will be brave enough and strong enough, to strengthen, or in light of a deterioration and growing war and expansion of war, then it will be a continuation of the negative voices in the world. But they do exist.
Thank you. Roy, you want to go ahead?
Well, I want to join what Omer and Eli just said, and look, we have to know where we are going. We have to have a political horizon in order to understand and calculate what we want to do now. Because if we don't know where we're going, so there's no sense not in the military steps you would take, not in the diplomatic, you don't know what to do. So if we agree that someone should take care of Gaza, someone should be responsible over Gaza, who would that be? Or it would be Israel, that we don't want to do that. Neither it would be Egypt, you heard Eli, or any other international forces. It has to be the Palestinians themselves. And if the Palestinians, and we accept the idea that it won't be Hamas, then who would it be? It have to be the Palestinians, the moderate one, the legitimate one, who recognize Israel and are ready to live side by side with Israel. And if you want to reach that point, then we can start and calculate the steps we need to take now in order to reach to that point. And it goes through elections in Israel and in Palestine Authority. And it goes through many other steps that we have to take now. We have to start right now to strengthen the moderate Palestinian fractions. For 30 years, Netanyahu strengthened Hamas with the settlements and the Jewish Zionist movement. They strengthened Hamas and in order to prevent any kind of compromise. We have to work now to strengthen the other side, the one who are ready to compromise. And for now, Israel has no functioning government, a legitimate one, and the Palestinian has no. So the role of the international community in this regard may be more profound than otherwise. For example, I cannot imagine the Palestinian Authority taking responsibility over Gaza while the Israeli army is opening the gates. It won't happen. So they can enter and take over Gaza only if they come with assets and legitimate assets. For example, a state. For example, if you want to strengthen the moderates now, and we are now in a process of prisoners exchange. Why won't you do it with the Palestinian Authority? Give them the credit for succeeding in achieving the Palestinian goal through diplomatic steps and not through terror. We have to do it whenever we can and start now. And unfortunately, the international community has a bigger role than I would want to. But this is the situation now in the absence of reasonable government in Israel and a legitimate one in the Palestinian Authority.
I'm going to add in one more question here, and then Gil, I know you had your hand up, but I will add this in because I think
just want to be very short about this question because I think that the person asking the question also asked for a very concise. We gave it a conceptual. About the probability of elections. And very, very concisely, two scenarios that might lead to election. One, we already see that Netanyahu is suffering from an incredible, unprecedented crisis of trust. 18%, 22% never seen in a case of war. That there's so little, I would say, it's not about lack of trust, it's mistrust of Netanyahu. And we see signs that some of his ministers in the Likud, the so-called princes and princesses of the Likud, Barkat, for example, and others, are starting to somewhat nibble or to show some discontent, especially on the responsibility issue. So if they, for example, shift, I mean, if the ground attack, God forbid, is kind of is causing many casualties, or there's all kinds of problems as such, and they start, going against him, then we might have a chance for some kind of a chance or re-election. Again, it's not a very powerful scenario, but it is technically a possibility. The other option is if the war expands, and then we might see an even broader emergency government with Lapid, with others, and but that's again, that's a less, an unlikely, more unlikely than likely probability.
So I'm going to lead into two that we have here that are connected to what we were just speaking about. How likely is it that Netanyahu will be voted out in the day after? And who from the Palestinian arena can you see as being a viable candidate for a reasonable leader?
I think that the question about the viable alternative to Abu Mazen was already discussed, but the issue of Netanyahu maybe and the chances of being voted the day after. Actually, Nadav, I'm just super curious about your thoughts on the matter.
So as I mentioned, even before the war, we saw in the polls that the liberal camp in Israel that was asleep, that had no energy and was not ideological, has woken up. And I believe that the next time we'll have elections, the liberals will win. According to the current polls, it seems that Benny Gantz will be the prime minister with some kind of coalition with Lapid and some others. And unlike people here, maybe in the audience from the United States, in Israel, the elections can happen every day. I mean, whenever the government is losing majority in Knesset. So we don't have to wait until the first Tuesday in November, as in America, in 4 years. And I do believe that after the war, there will either be people from Likud who will say that Netanyahu became more of a liability than an asset, and will think that the best thing for them is to go for leadership of Likud, and in this way Likud will break up and lead to election. Or if the partners of Netanyahu, because of the American pressure not to be too assertive, will say this is not the right-wing government that we wanted, and they will break the government. But I do think that after the war, this government will fall, and in the next elections, the liberal camp will win the elections. When I say liberal, of course, not all of the liberals are liberals in my way, because too many Israeli liberals think that to be a liberal is only when someone is going after your rights, and that democracy is only for Jews. So we have a work to do in order to make sure that people understand that liberalism, meaning also caring for the Israeli Palestinian citizens, and also that occupation and democracy could not go hand in hand. But I'm optimistic that after this tragedy, we will have a better politics in Israel, and backed with maybe an American leadership to turn this tragedy into an opportunity. The Yom Kippur War as an example. I really want you to remain optimistic and not give up on Israel.
Thank you, Nadav. So the next question here is, has Mitveim done any research on the feasibility of the two-state solution given the actual settlement situation? First of all, I'll direct you to our 2023 Foreign Policy Index. We did do research on this, and what we've come up with is roughly 36% of the Israeli public does see the pursuit of the two-state solution as their desired outcome for how the government handles this. Moreover, we see 46% of Israeli Arabs strive for peace based on a two-state solution. So these are really promising numbers we have here, and I will link the document right here so that you can take a look at it. Gil, do you want to follow up on that at all a little bit?
Sure. I mean, if we speak about first of all, we have to understand that whatever we said about feasibility was tossed out of the window on the 7th of October. By the way, for better or worse. Okay, I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat the situation and say that the 7th of October made Israelis realize that they need to fight against those who would not live with them and pursue peace with those who are willing. And I think, by the way, the events of the 7th of October, we present a very optimistic picture here, but the events of 7th of October is what you call the constitutive trauma in the Israeli memory for generations to come. Okay, unequivalent, really. And there are, by the way, they define, there's the backlash regarding Israeli belief in coexistence and so on and so forth is important. But I think that what is becoming more clear to Israelis is whether they like it, they assess the feasibility, they think that it might work, there is a partner, there's no partner, that there's a necessity to deal with the Palestinians in order to build or to fight or to survive vis-a-vis the Iranian threat. Nadav and I used to have long discussions for years whether the Iranian threat or the Palestinian threat is a more urgent issue. Today we understand that one is part of the other, and there's a combination. So there's a necessity today to deal with the topic. In the survey that you mentioned, one of the most interesting factors was, and I don't remember the exact number, so I can improvise and then you can correct me, that while you mentioned 36 is 4 and so on, there's a huge part of the Israeli society, I think almost a third of the respondents, they just don't know. The jury is still out. And these events really shape the mindset. So if you are able to present a plan, a feasible plan, with partners that are able, gradually or otherwise, maybe Omer can speak about evolving peace later on as the road for such a thing. We see that if you can present such a plan, you can change the mindset. Omer, would you like me to say a word here about evolving peace, or you want to add something about it? Okay, I mean, what we've seen is that when we present the overarching concept of a two-state solution tomorrow morning, returning to the negotiation table tomorrow morning, Israelis are very skeptic. And by the way, I can understand why, rightfully so. But when we offer a number of crucial steps that are all about improving the relations between Israelis and Palestinians, while also changing or building a two-state reality, things like stopping or developing Palestinians building in Area C, or specific steps, building a joint mechanism for conflict prevention, Israeli-Palestinian Jerusalem, then the support of the Israelis is immense, between 55 to 65%, almost a schizophrenia, a split identity between the practicalities of building a two-state reality and between buying the entire package tomorrow morning. And that gives us hope. Now we're going to have to test and see how those numbers relate to what we experience right now. Just as one sentence to finish with it, I think that Israelis understand today that one of the biggest fears right now, anxieties, is Hamas taking over in the West Bank. So strengthening the PA is no longer a luxury. It's no longer a theoretical question about whether we should or shouldn't. It's a must. It's a necessity on the security level. And that gives me hope, again, from a very negative place of anxieties, that we can re-engage and the public would re-engage with the idea of two-state solution.
Thank you, Gil. We have a few questions left, but we have to wrap it up, unfortunately, for today. For those of you, one more you want to do?
No, I say no, one last, and I think because just
yes.
respecting the time of our speakers and our audience.
Yes, exactly. We can do one last question. I'll do this one from Susie. I think this is a very interesting question, and maybe I'll bring it over to Maya over here. People keep talking about a political horizon for the day after, but the Israeli leadership keeps saying the war could take years. We can't wait years to address the political situation. How do the panelists see movement in that direction while the war goes on?
Well, I think here politics are intertwined with the security situation. There have been estimations that this is the interest of Netanyahu to prolong this war as much as he can. I'm not sure that the United States, which is very much involved, will allow him to do so, but we'll have to see how it evolves. Nadav, if you have any more insights on that, you're most welcome to join. I think the Israeli public would be sensitive to the number of casualties here as well, despite the fact that right now, before the military entrance into Gaza, it didn't take place. So the number of casualties, civilian casualties, already the highest ever in Israel under such circumstances. And I think that the public opinion would probably switch even more to the negative, and once we enter this war. And I think that the voices that are telling the government that it will be extremely difficult to fight Hamas and actually win completely over are perhaps a bit too ambitious. And we hear already the prime minister and his people around him trying to decrease that this promise that was made by the government is somewhat maybe an indicator.
Thank you, Maya. Roy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add and go back to what I said and others about the role of other actors to push forward. Inside Israel, we have not a lot of leverage over this specific government. Okay, it holds power for now. But others do have. When I'm talking about steps that can be taken in order to promote, or to bring us closer to the day after. Think, for example, about Biden administration, who recognize a Palestinian state in the West Bank, drawing the lines for the day after now. First, it possesses the, okay, where we're going. It says very clearly we're going there. Secondly, it allows the political, it opens the political debate inside Israel on this question, and can help to throw our government, this current government, throw it away. It helps us. So just one example. I'm not sure this is the time to do that exactly. Maybe this is not the exact move, but other actors can contribute first to depict the day after, where we're going, and to draw the lines now. There is where we're going, and contribute for throwing this horrible government, Israel government, away. And Nadav wished to add something.
Thank you, Roy. Nadav, we'll have you as our last comment here before we wrap up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I very much agree with Roy. Israelis are going to be confused now for a long time after this trauma, just like they were confused after the Yom Kippur War, and even more because in the Yom Kippur War, we had a lot of soldiers killed. This time it's civilians taken from their beds. But the international community can make a huge difference. Of course, I'm talking mostly about the US, and I would add to what Roy said, that an American leadership taking this consensus in the international arena about the two-state solution, the only thing that China, Russia, and the US could agree on, bring it to the Security Council, recognize a Palestinian state, use the Arab Initiative as parameters to negotiations, and promote Palestinian elections. That could change the Israeli state of mind when Israelis will go to the polls in a tremendous way, and could lead this confusion into support of something concrete.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I just want to thank all of our experts today for coming on and sharing their perspectives and their perspectives from each different region that we covered. We will be holding many more briefings like this in the future. We are extremely interested in keeping everyone up to date with our information, and we thank you all for joining us today. Have a nice day, everyone, and please stay safe.